The Nobel Prize-winning Rhodesian novelist Doris Lessing wrote, "Humanity's legacy of stories and storytelling is the most precious we have. All wisdom is in our stories and songs. A story is how we construct our experiences. At the very simplest, it can be he, she was born, lived, died. Probably that is the template of our stories, a beginning, a middle, and an end. The structure is in our minds." For Mother's Day this year, I plan to reflect on how women have been traditional keepers of the narrative, caretakers of the wisdom in our stories and songs. My parents restored a family Bible from my mother's side of the family. The records go back to the time of the Civil War, and on the designated pages, marriages and births can be found carefully written in florid penmanship. So where does your story begin? There are so many ways you might choose to answer that question. How big a circle do you want to draw? You could begin with your childhood, with your parents and grandparents, perhaps referencing a family Bible. Some would draw the circle larger and describe the report they received from 23andMe or the research that they did on Ancestry.com. Others might want the circle to include what they see as the very beginning. Some might point back to the Garden of Eden and include the story of a prolific apple-chomping couple who briefly resided there. Others might begin at the Big Bang and include the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Perhaps it's even less possible to be specific about how our story is going to play out. Again, I ask, how big a circle do you want to draw? If the last 2.5 years have taught us anything, perhaps it is that Robert Burns was correct when he wrote, "The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry." Well, DeSantis is doing his best to thwart the plans of the mouse, and some of my plans for this sermon went awry this week. Last Sunday, I did what some of you have told me you enjoy, and I watched the live stream in my jammies with a cup of coffee in my hand. Dr. Bosson talked about workers' rights and May Day. He then proceeded to reference Baba Ifalade, who had spoken right here in this sanctuary as part of our Religion in Houston's Pan-African Community series. I had also planned to reference his remarks this morning, and Reverend Colin actually used some of the same quotes I was planning to use. Since he's not here, I can tell you how annoyed I was. But after a bit of reflection, I realized how significant the concept of ancestors and legacy must be. That for two such disparate holidays as International Workers' Day and Mother's Day, this idea would be relevant and meaningful. But as I quoted a moment ago, all wisdom is in our stories and songs. A story is how we construct our experience. Sometime last year, when we were assigning themes for each month, we settled on reimagining success for May. Perhaps the flurry of graduations at this time of year, or the optimistic hopes for a successful reopening after COVID, gave us the idea. I really don't remember. Last week, Reverend Colin foreshadowed my remarks this morning by talking about, in his words, those he was related to by blood and those who he was connected to through spirit. Main characters in our stories are not only our blood relatives, but those mentors, leaders, and luminaries who have played a vital role in our lives. And of course, for Mother's Day, I had planned to honor mothers and all those who have played such pivotal roles in our lives, as well as reflecting on our ancestors and those whose stories we are carrying on. So perhaps a better theme this month would have been reimagining legacy. But in an interesting twist, I did talk about reimagining success last year on Mother's Day, even though I didn't use those same words. I talked about a mother's ability to see the potential in her offspring, commenting not only on Jesus' mother Mary, but Wilma Rudolph's mother Blanche, and how a Spanish painter you may have heard of said, "My mother said to me, if you become a soldier, you'll be a general. If you become a monk, you'll end up the Pope. Instead, I became a painter and wound up as Picasso." The other way my plans for my sermon went awry was the leak of the Supreme Court's draft opinion on Monday night, reversing Roe versus Wade. It is something I cannot choose to ignore this morning, even if it did not affect in a huge way an individual's right to choose to become a mother. Support by the American public for the Supreme Court is deteriorating. The politicization of the court, fueled by its swing to the right due to Republican-led Senates denying both Presidents Obama and Biden nominations, has led the public to question whether the judges are following law or politics. The fact that the recently appointed judges misled under oath what their views on the issue are adds to the distrust of the court. I was pleased that there were dozens of UUs at the rallies at City Hall on Tuesday and at Discovery Green yesterday. We were there to add our voices to those outraged that these rights are pretty clearly on the chopping block. And the trigger laws passed in 13 states prove they've been planning this. Our standing up against injustice is part of a UU's DNA. And we not only show up, we do it in yellow shirts. As our second reading made clear, Judge Alito's reasoning is the tip of the white supremacy iceberg that will attack the rights of anyone who is not a privileged, cisgender, straight, white male. Denying rights to their own physical autonomy and health decisions for those who can get pregnant is problematic enough. But the attacks upon more and more of us will continue if not stopped now. One of my favorite lyrics from the Muppet movie is, "Life's like a movie, write your own ending." If we are to write our own story, determine our own ending, we cannot be denied the ability to make our own decisions. And I'm hard-pressed to think of a decision more personal and less needing to be regulated as when and if to become a mother. You may have seen this quote by Ruth Bader Ginsburg being circulated on social media this week. "The decision whether or not to bear a child is central to a woman's life, to her well-being and dignity. It is a decision she must make for herself. When the government controls that decision for her, she is being treated as less than a full adult human, responsible for her own choices." Judge Ginsburg influenced and will continue to influence generations of women. I reiterate, as Reverend Cullen indicated last week, we are influenced by those we are related to by blood and those who we are connected to through spirit. He relayed how Baba Ifalade described Christianity and modern culture have seemed to look suspiciously at ancestor worship. But nevertheless, we still invoke the names of ancestors daily, which he showed by giving numerous examples, like the names of our cities. He told us there is ancestor worship going on around you constantly. Baba Ifalade is an Ifa priest and practitioner of, among other things, New Orleans hoodoo and voodoo. But ancestor worship and veneration is part of many sects and religions, especially throughout Africa and Asian cultures. Well, no one knows better than a UU minister how some people react to the word worship. Ancestor veneration is the act of honoring, while the word worship derives from to give worth to something. So they're really not that different, so I think that connotation is playing a lot more than a minor role here. In many cultures worldwide, ancestors are venerated to honor them with love and respect, and to cultivate kinship values with surviving relatives and the continuity of the family lineage. The Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox Church venerate saints as intercessors with God. I couldn't help but think of the huge emphasis on ancestors found in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. The book of Genesis has verses upon verses and chapters upon chapters of begats, lists of who was the father of whom, the omission of the mother's names, indicative of the consideration of women as property. It doesn't take a lengthy internet search to discover the alleged genealogy of Jesus of Nazareth. One site I found carefully lists the begats from the stable in Bethlehem through Abraham all the way back to Adam. Both sides are shown, Mary and Joseph, and their branches of the family tree deviate from the same limb about the time of David and Solomon. Of course, legend has it that Joseph is the adoptive father of Jesus, not the biological father, and yet his patrilineal bloodline is carefully annotated. One can't help but wonder why. So all this focus on ancestors would seem to bolster, not belittle, an emphasis on ancestor veneration, if not worship. And yet we in the West seem to look askance at the practice, especially if it's being practiced by religions unfamiliar to us. But as Reverend Colin asked last week, who are your ancestors? Who do you owe for what you have, and why? At the beginning, I suggested that answer might depend on how big a circle you draw and whom you decide to include. Who has been a part of your story? Today is a day set aside to give a shout out to our moms, and I encourage you to do so if you're able, and I certainly acknowledge there are myriad reasons why that may not be possible. And I want to use that as a springboard as we consider how our stories will continue. How big a circle do you want to draw? Who do you want to include in your story in the future as it plays out? Because, at least as of today, we still have the right to decide. The Broadway musical Baby tells the story of three couples who are expecting a child. At the end of the first act, Lizzie feels her baby kick in her stomach for the first time. She realizes that the child will live on after her and that life will continue. She sings the song, "The Story Goes On." Some cultures draw the circle beyond blood relations, today and tomorrow, but to those they will never know, well into the future. The concept of 7-generation stewardship is believed to have originated with the Iroquois. The idea is to make decisions taking into consideration those living up to 7 generations after us. So, not only might we consider the impact we have on those around us and their children and grandchildren, but those beyond. How will our story read in 525 years? But of course, what we do can benefit immensely those here now. I don't have any biological kids, but I've had lots of kids in my coming of age and YRUU classes. One of the really cool things is when we would take the 9th graders to Boston on our heritage trip. It was the evening talks at the end of the day. Over and over, I would be pleasantly surprised that the things we had taught during the year that had seemingly fallen on deaf ears were being brought up by the youth and earnestly discussed. Many of you are or have been teachers or professors, whether in public school, university, or Sunday school. You have had an impact. Your story goes on through those you have taught. In the words of Stephen Sondheim, careful the things you say, children will listen. Oh, and there's a brand new musical playing off-Broadway at the Public Theater. It's called SUFS, S-U-F-F-S. And it features an all-female cast portraying a group of suffragists in the 7 years leading up to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Those fighting for women's suffrage were, of course, demanding that women be allowed to vote. Women have had to fight for their rights for a very long time. Friday morning on the Today Show, I happened to catch one of the stars, FIRSTUU, who happened to be nominated for a Tony for originating the role of Eliza Hamilton in Hamilton. She described the show SUFS. At the end of the day, the important thing that I hope that people take away from the show is that the fight for justice is not done by one person's generation alone. It's the generations that have come before us. It's the generations that will come after us. And we owe it to their legacy, to honor their legacy, to show up to the ballot box, to participate in democracy, and honor what they fought and strived so hard for. So I ask again, what are you going to do with the legacy that you have been given by those blood relatives and those mentors whose story you now continue, as they have instilled values in us which propel our narrative forward? So we look ahead to those whom we inspire to continue our story. Our story goes on.